The sword moved on its own. That's what George Takei said afterward, quietly, almost to himself, not as a punchline, not as promotion, but as something he clearly still wasn't sure how to explain. One moment it was sitting on a dusty shelf in a cramped attic set at CBS Studios. The next, the air in the room had changed. The two actors weren't performing anymore. They were fighting. And nobody, not the director, not the producers, not the network executives watching the monitor, knew exactly how to stop what was happening. What you're about to learn isn't just the story of a television episode. It's the story of a piece of film so combustible, so genuinely dangerous in what it exposed about America's open wounds, that the most powerful broadcast network in the country decided the only safe thing to do was make it disappear. For 52 years, it was gone. And the reason it came back is almost as disturbing as the reason it vanished. To understand why the encounter shook CBS to its core, you have to understand what the Twilight Zone actually was, and more importantly, what it was secretly doing to American living rooms every single week. Rod Serling didn't create the Twilight Zone because he loved science fiction. He created it because he was furious. By the mid-1950s, Serling was already one of the most celebrated television writers in America. A man whose scripts had the kind of moral weight that made network executives sweat through their shirts. He had tried, repeatedly, to write serious drama about the ugliest truths of American life. Racial violence, injustice, the machinery of hatred grinding ordinary people to dust. And every single time, the sponsors and the network suits had dismantled his work before it could reach an audience. They changed characters. They relocated settings. They softened language until the original message was completely hollowed out, leaving behind nothing but the shell of a story that once had something real to say. The breaking point came with his attempt to dramatize the murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black boy lynched in Mississippi in 1955. Serling poured himself into that script. The networks poured it down the drain. What aired bore almost no resemblance to what he had written. The fury that event ignited in him never really cooled. It redirected, and what it produced was one of the most brilliant acts of creative insurgency in television history. If the censors wouldn't let him talk about racism on Earth, he would talk about it on other planets. If they wouldn't allow him to depict prejudice between Americans, he would show it between species. He discovered that a network executive who would get a script about racial injustice in Mississippi would happily approve the exact same script if the victim was a green-skinned alien on a distant moon. The monster, Serling realized, was the perfect disguise. But here's what most people miss about that strategy. And this is the part that changes everything you think you know about the show. Serling's greatest weapon wasn't the twist ending. It wasn't the supernatural element. It was the audience's own discomfort arriving before they had time to put their defenses up. By the time a viewer realized what a Twilight Zone episode was actually about, they had already felt it. They had already agreed with it. The trap had already closed. And that is precisely why, when one episode finally dropped the disguise entirely and stared directly into one of America's most painful and unresolved wounds, the reaction wasn't just controversy. It was institutional panic. The encounter aired on May 1st, 1964. Season 5. The show was already in its twilight. The ratings had softened. The budgets had shrunk. And Serling himself was running on fumes after years of writing at a pace that would have broken most people twice over. But this episode arrived with a kind of coiled, dangerous energy that set it apart from almost everything else in the series. 2 actors, 1 location, 90 minutes of rehearsal time before cameras rolled, and a script that was, depending on your perspective, either a profound examination of wartime guilt or a deeply irresponsible piece of storytelling that weaponized a community's suffering. The premise is deceptively simple. A World War II veteran named Fenton, aging and restless, rattles around his cluttered attic with the quiet desperation of a man who won the war but lost something he can't name. He hires a young Japanese-American man named Arthur Takamori, played by a 26-year-old George Takei, for yard work. The two end up in the attic together. Conversation begins, and at the center of the room, hanging on the wall like a wound that never closed, is a samurai sword, a trophy Fenton took from a Japanese soldier he killed during the war. The sword, in the logic of the episode, is not merely decorative. It is a supernatural accelerant, a cursed object that strips away every polite fiction the two men have constructed around their shared history and forces them to speak the unspeakable. What unfolds in that attic is unlike almost anything else the Twilight Zone ever produced. There are no aliens, no ironic genies, no twist ending where the audience discovers the protagonist was dead the whole time. What there is instead is something rawer and more uncomfortable. Two men from opposite sides of a catastrophic historical trauma, locked in a room together, unable to leave, unable to lie. The veteran confesses things. The young man reveals things. And the sword, the episode suggests, is pulling it all to the surface, whether they wanted to or not. George Takei was, at that point, a working actor building toward the role that would define his public life. He brought to Arthur Takamori a quiet dignity that the script itself didn't always afford the character. And that tension between what Takei was doing with the role and what the script was asking him to carry is exactly where the episode's central controversy lives. Because the script contained a plot point so inflammatory, so historically irresponsible, that it became impossible for many viewers to see past it. The episode strongly implies, that Arthur's father had been a traitor, that he had collaborated with Japan in the lead-up to the Pearl Harbor attacks. You have to understand what that accusation meant in 1964 to grasp why CBS reacted the way it did. The Japanese-American community had spent the previous 2 decades trying to recover from one of the most devastating civil rights violations in American history. During World War II, over 100,000 Japanese Americans had been forced from their homes and imprisoned in internment camps, not because of any evidence of disloyalty, but because of their ethnicity. Families were separated, businesses were destroyed, lives were derailed and never fully recovered. And now, in 1964, as that community was still rebuilding, still seeking recognition, still waiting for an apology that would not come for another 2 decades, a primetime network television show had broadcast the suggestion that their fathers and grandfathers had been traitors all along. The backlash was immediate and it was severe. Japanese American advocacy organizations contacted CBS directly. The criticism wasn't simply that the episode was offensive. It was that it was dangerous. It took a real historical tragedy, one that was still living in the bodies and memories of actual people, and retrofitted it into a piece of supernatural entertainment without stopping to consider the human cost of that choice. The network didn't argue. It didn't issue a statement defending the episode's artistic intent. It quietly pulled the encounter from rotation and, unlike almost every other episode of the series, ensured it would not appear in syndication packages. Not one rerun. Not a single marathon inclusion. For decades, if you hadn't seen it the night it aired, you simply hadn't seen it. George Takei, in later interviews, acknowledged the controversy with characteristic thoughtfulness. He understood why the episode had been pulled. He also understood that within the darkness of the script, there had been something genuinely worth examining. The way war doesn't end when the guns go silent, the way trauma and guilt transmit themselves across generations, the way 2 people from opposite sides of a historical catastrophe might find themselves unable to share the same room without the past pressing in. But understanding the intent, he made clear, didn't erase the harm of the execution. And what makes the encounter so endlessly fascinating and so uncomfortable to sit with even today is that it exists in that specific moral territory where ambition and irresponsibility become almost impossible to separate. Serling, who was not the credited writer on this episode, had built an entire series on the premise that fiction could say what direct speech could not, that a story about prejudice dressed in the costume of science fiction could reach an audience that a straightforward documentary never would. But the encounter stripped the costume off. It used real names, real history, real trauma, and it got some of that history wrong in ways that caused real damage to real people. The very weapons Serling had forged to protect social commentary from the censors had, in this instance, been picked up and swung without sufficient care. There's another layer here that rarely gets discussed. The encounter aired on May 1st, 1964. The United States was already sliding toward full military engagement in Vietnam, a war that would bring its own catastrophic wave of anti-Asian prejudice, violence, and scapegoating. The cultural moment in which this episode broadcast its suggestion of Japanese-American disloyalty was not a neutral one. It was a moment when Asian Americans were already navigating a landscape of suspicion and hostility that had never fully dissipated from the World War II era. The timing didn't cause the episode's problems, but it made those problems matter in ways that reverberated far beyond a single night of television. CBS buried the encounter so thoroughly that for most of the show's long afterlife in syndication and home video, it simply did not exist. While every other episode was being rewatched, reanalyzed, celebrated, and endlessly referenced in classrooms and film schools and late-night conversations, this one remained invisible. The show that made its name by forcing Americans to look at themselves in the mirror had, for once, decided to cover a mirror rather than let anyone near it. The episode finally resurfaced on January 1st, 2016, 52 years after it first aired, during a New Year's Day Twilight Zone marathon on a cable channel. There was no fanfare, no special introduction. It appeared in the lineup the way a ghost appears in a hallway, suddenly, and without explanation, and leaving people unsure afterward whether they had really seen what they thought they saw. Takei, by then, was a very different public figure than the young actor who had stood in that attic in 1964. He had spent decades as an activist, particularly for the rights of Japanese Americans seeking redress for the internment and later for LGBTQ equality. When the encounter finally emerged from its vault, he was able to engage with its reappearance from a position of hard-won perspective. The episode was imperfect. The episode had caused harm. The episode also contained, buried beneath its most problematic choices, a genuine attempt to wrestle with the psychology of inherited guilt and the impossible mathematics of historical accountability. It could be all of those things simultaneously. Most important historical artifacts are what the encounter ultimately reveals about the Twilight Zone, about Rod Serling's project, and about the culture that produced and then suppressed it, is something that the show's most celebrated episodes only gesture toward. The Twilight Zone was never simply entertainment. It was an argument, an ongoing, weekly argument that the darkness in American life was not something that existed out there, in the alien or the monster or the ironic twist of fate, but in here, in the living room, in the attic, in the conversation between two men who cannot share a room without history flooding in between them. The episode failed, in important ways, to live up to the responsibility that argument demanded, but its failure is itself instructive. It shows the precise boundary between bold social commentary and careless storytelling, a boundary that Serling spent his career walking, that the best episodes of the Twilight Zone crossed successfully, and that the encounter stumbled across in the wrong direction. The fact that CBS's response was to make the episode disappear rather than to engage with the questions it raised is its own kind of lesson. Erasure is not accountability. Silence is not an apology. Locking something in a vault for half a century doesn't resolve what it got wrong. It just postpones the conversation. And some conversations, it turns out, cannot be postponed forever. Rod Serling built a dimension without a map, a place where the rules of ordinary reality bent in service of something deeper, the persistent, uncomfortable truth that what we refuse to examine has a way of finding us anyway. The encounter was buried because it was dangerous. But the most honest thing you can say about it, 52 years later, is that it was dangerous in the way that only the truth can be. Not the truth it claimed to tell about one specific family's wartime history. The deeper truth, that the wounds a country refuses to treat don't heal on their own. They wait, in the attic, quiet and patient and absolutely certain that one day, someone will open the door,